Hello, everybody. Okay, I guess we're gonna get started. So this is period 6. Basically, it's from 1865 to 1898, and it includes the Reconstruction era and the Gilded Age. APUSH textbooks 15 through 20. So let's start with Reconstruction. So as you know, the Civil War divided the nation. Abraham Lincoln basically saved the Union, and now they're trying to deal with Southern integration, where they try to get the South to rejoin the Union, and basically this is the Reconstruction era. So because of this war, the South was basically economically destroyed. Their economy was destroyed from total war, which is basically the strategy where any resource that the enemy can use must be taken away from them, aka destroyed. So their economy suffered from total war, and because former slaves were freed, they have nowhere to go, and they have little opportunity. So they're stuck in the South, basically roaming around, and there's like 4 million of them. And one fourth of the men in the South, one fourth of the white men who fought in the war, died in the South, died in the Civil War, and thus causing like a lack of manpower, so to say. So because of all these issues, especially about the freed slaves, the federal government wanted to help them. Wait, let me check. Okay. The federal government wanted to help them. So in order to do that, they created like the Freedmen's Bureau. They created like policies. They intervened on occasionally intervened to help the former slaves. So the Freedmen's Bureau was basically created to help freed slaves by redistributing some land for slaves to farm and later own, and they set up schools for black children. So that is a huge part of the Reconstruction era, which was the Freedmen's Bureau, because it showed that, as you can see, this image depicted the Freedmen's Bureau, where you showed, well, it doesn't depict the Freedmen's Bureau, but like it shows the government helping the former slaves against the whites in the South, because as you know, the slaves weren't treated very well because of black suppression, where they try to suppress the voting rights of the slaves. So the federal government had to step in and help the slaves out. And one of the programs was the Freedmen's Bureau. So while in this era, well, the slaves did gain some rights and did gain a lot of rights and various opportunities. They were still majorly oppressed. Blacks were still in poverty and suffered under the black codes and Jim Crow. Basically, uh, Jim Crow is where they were seen as almost like children, where they have like they're immature and like because of that they're segregated. And this is and like all these attempts to oppress these black people were trying to suppress their votes because now that they can vote, they can influence politics. They're enfranchised. So basically, the South weren't too happy about that one. And now later on, Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson becomes president. But before he became president, there was some amendments that were passed. The 13th Amendment basically banned slavery. The 14th Amendment basically defined citizenship, defined privileges and immunities, and gave some federal authority to the Union, so that way they can interfere in like in how the states treat everybody. And basically, the 15th Amendment basically stated that it basically protected the blacks from any legal oppression against their vote. And now going back to Andrew Johnson. So uh, Andrew Johnson was willing to forgive the South lightly. He just wanted them back into the Union. So, however, a lot of the Congress at the time were made up of different parties. So you have some conservative Republicans, which basically did not want to give so many conditions to the South, so they can easily rejoin the Union. Some moderate Republicans who want to give some punishments, but they still want the South to uh, not to be heavily punished, so that way they can still rejoin the Union. And some radical Republicans who want to severely punish the South, um, and basically uh, kind of restructure their hierarchy, so that way it's not as biased towards former slaves. Uh, However, the Black Codes, which basically kind of made vagrancy illegal, which basically meant that if a former slave, especially blacks, this applied to everybody. However, they only caught African Americans, and what happened was that if you didn't have a job, you would be considered a vagrant. And since they were in this economic crisis, they're justifying it by saying if you don't have a job, you're a burden to society, and they force you into these cotton and chain gangs. Basically, they force you to pick cotton or like build railroads, uh, and like they're kind of like prison gangs almost. And basically, this radicalized a lot of the Northerners who saw the Black Codes and kind of turned them into radical Republicans. So there was a lot of support for radical Republicans at the time. And because of this support, we got to eventually the Reconstruction era would turn into a military Reconstruction, where a lot of the military would step into the South and form districts, military districts in the South, to better support and uphold law, Union law in the South. So going back to Johnson, Johnson wanted to forgive the South and not set as many conditions as possible. However, he was stopped by the Senate with such things as the Tenure Office Act of 1867, which basically protected the Secretary of War by needing the Congress to approve the firing of a cabinet member. Because as you know, during military reconstruction, the military was was basically operating in the South. They were dictating the law in there. There were military courts, and military personnel were the ones who sought out law. And as the president, Johnson was the commander in chief, so he could order these military troops, including the Secretary of War. But the Secretary of War disagreed with Johnson and supported military reconstruction. So Congress tried to stop him from firing the Secretary of War by using the Tenure of Office Act of 1867. Another act would be the Commander of Army Act of 1867 that protected the military reconstruction by giving Johnson the only authority to command Grant, General Grant, which basically he was basically the commander of the army at the time, and he was a big supporter of military reconstruction, and he pitied the African Americans in the South. So by making him only be able to give orders to Grant, he'll basically be powerless to stop military reconstruction. So these conflicts between Johnson and Congress almost led to his impeachment, but he did not get impeached. Uh, so, however, going back to the daily life of a former slave in the South. Wait, let me see if. Okay. So going back to the daily life of a former slave in the South, uh, this is very important to know. They suffered from things such as sharecropping and the cropland system, where basically sharecropping was that former slaves, because they didn't have the capital or the or any of like skill or opportunities to become, well, generally they didn't have the skills or opportunities to become any other professions besides a farmer. They would basically go mostly just go to the south, try to find some kind of landlord and ask to borrow some land. They would rent that land to start their own farms. And because they didn't have any money, they couldn't farm nor rent the land, but they still had to provide for themselves. So what they did was that they promised the landlord to basically give them a share of their crop, maybe like 20%, 30%, something like that of their crops, in return for using this land. And now they have the land down, but they still need the tools and the seeds and everything like that. So the cropland system came into play, where basically general stores started popping up near these crop sharing systems, crop sharing farms, and they would pop up and then give these former slaves like the capital to basically start their own farm. But they will also need to basically pay them back in terms of like crops or like when they have some money. This basically meant the slaves, when they fell into hard times, they basically lost everything because they couldn't pay back the debts and they still had to feed themselves. And even if they pay back their debts, they usually would end up in this perpetual debt where basically they farm everything, they eat, they give the rest to the land. Well, actually, they give the they pay back their debt to the landlord and the general, and then they eat, and then they would borrow again, borrow the land again, and borrow the same capital again to restart their farm each season. So after Johnson, there will be President Grant. He went from commander of the army to president. And during the Grant admin, there was a lot of crime and corruption. So to name a few, there would be like the Credit Mobile or controversy, where uh, basically these people, uh, people in like Congress, they would like own businesses, and in return, they would uh, because everything that businesses gained was from the government. They needed charters to like do stuff. So basically, in return, Congress like they would pay their own companies to do their to use these charters and kind of benefit themselves only instead of going to like the other corporations. They would only benefit themselves. Another thing is the whiskey ring, where basically members of Congress extorted illegal whiskey and kind of just made money off that. Oh, the Grant admin also bought Alaska as well. So during the Grant admin, there was a lot of. Wait, let me check if the stream is okay. All right. So during the Grant admin, there was just a lot of corruption and like a lot of scandals and a lot of controversy. Uh, one major scandal is a corruption, form of corruption in like throughout the administrations, especially during the Gilded Age, was was political machines. Let me find a picture. All right, here you go. So basically, political machines were kind of starting from the bottom all the way to the top, corruption. So basically, uh, as you know, during this time, the Congress was basically ruled by Republicans, and political machines usually were in these big cities where there was like high density population, and they would recruit like these freshly arrived immigrants or like people in poverty. So they would recruit them as like their voters. So where these political machines would help out these voters, and in return they would give their vote towards a selected member of the political machine. And in return, as they give these votes, uh, the the people in power now are now controlled by this political machine, and the people in power would therefore nominate somebody until it goes up to the state, goes up to the national level, and so on and so forth. So you can see how political machines were a big part of the corruption, especially during the Grant admin, and especially during the Gilded Age. So going back to some of the suffering that former blacks had to go through. As you know, I mentioned about voter suppression in the South, where they try to suppress the black vote. So through suppression came through many forms, such as poll taxes, where you have to basically, well, poll taxes was basically where you had to pay money until you can get to a vote. You have the KKK, which basically sets up violent patrols to scare blacks from voting, and they lynch people to kind of demoralize the blacks from voting. It's kind of like a threat, and they suffered a lot from voter suppression. But there were some big cases as well, such as uh, black people did try to fight this in the Supreme Court during Reconstruction, such as Plessy versus Ferguson. Basically, what happened was that they went to this rail cart, and and a black man was forced to use different facilities as opposed to a white man, and they brought this to the Supreme Court eventually, and the Supreme Court basically ruled that segregation can exist as long as the facilities were equal, which were usually not equal in terms of quality. Uh, Another big, but after the Grant admin, they needed to re-elect people, and then came the 1877 Compromise, where basically they wanted a Republican president in charge of the nation, but they weren't sure sure of the power they held. Now that the South is back, they're not sure if they're willing to accept this president. So what they did was that the Republican President Hayes would become president, but in return, he would end military reconstruction, and Southern Democrats would become a party again and be allowed into national politics. So that was basically the 1877 compromise, where in return for a Republican president, they would end military reconstruction and basically allow Democrats into national politics again. So basically, Southern Democrats returned to power, and Hayes officially ends Reconstruction, and the troops left. And this basically left the blacks in the South defenseless. Uh, Now that they're defenseless, troops in the South can no longer stop the KKK. They can't stop the black. They can't stop Jim Crow. Speaking of Jim Crow, it rose into significant prominence in the South, where they're just basically treated as children, and they're just segregated in the South. Uh, However, you gotta know during this time there was a lot of party politics. Basically, regions and cultures were basically forced into one party or another. So basically, in the North, we have Northerners, we have Union, you have in the North we basically have Republicans, and basically the Northerners see the Republicans as like uh, as like Lincoln basically preserving the Union, and there was a lot of corporations. Those were two different factors based on how you live and based on how you see your party. Basically, all the North was Republican, and in the South you have like Southerners and workers. A lot of workers were part of the Democratic Party because it was kind of, and Southerners were part of the Democratic Party as a cultural heritage. However, the workers were part of it because they were afraid. They originally they were afraid of the South freeing the slaves, and uh, and that would basically cause their the laborers' work to be degraded because they can have all this free labor now, cheap labor as opposed to the workers' more expensive labor. And speaking of labor, going as you remember, I hope you can remember. The free soil, the Republicans were originally based on a free soil party, where basically they did not want. Sorry, I'm just gonna text. There might be some sort of technical difficulty. All right, thanks. Okay. So basically, the Free Soil Party wanted to stop the expansions of slavery throughout the country, so that the factories in the North wouldn't be influenced and have so much cheap labor. That was eventually what they were based on. Eventually, Lincoln turned it into an abolitionist party, where as they grew more radical, they wanted to free the slaves instead of preserve the Union. But originally, it was based on preserving the Union. Okay, let me fix. Okay, there we go. So we're going to another topic called. Uh, we're going to go to a topic of immigration and the West. So immigration and the West. Basically, let's start off with some important notes about immigration. So during this time period, Chinese immigrants were immigrating for the gold rush and later to help build the transcontinental railroad. Well, they did immigrate for for the railroad. They immigrated for the gold rush, and as they were there, they were eventually hired to help build the transcontinental railroad. Okay, and as these Chinese immigrants started coming in, and more immigrants started coming in, they were faced with a lot of racism and bias, especially during when economic panic struck. Basically, what happened is that they would hire. Sorry, there was just a lot of technical difficulties going on. They would basically hire the white people over newly arrived immigrants based on their race instead of their job quality. So basically, what happened was that as more immigrants started arriving, especially in the West, and like big cities such as like New York, basically what happened was that enclaves basically started to pop out. Basically, Chinatowns and like Little Italy or whatever, you would have these ethnic enclaves that offered protection uh, from like the outside world towards like their, I don't know, preferred race, and like they would offer economic opportunities as well, where basically in these ethnic enclaves they would basically offer you more opportunities such as like jobs as opposed to outside. uh, then we would have the Chinese Exclusion Act, where basically, here's a picture, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So you would see, you would notice that it says Gates of Liberty, but this Chinese dude is basically cannot go in there. But he's sitting on order, industry, peace. I can't read that. Sobriety. Yeah, basically he was sober. But you can see that notice communists, nihilists, socialists, Fenian, and what is that? Can't read it. Welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen. So basically, they would offer a lot of they would offer immigration to all these kinds of people, except for Chinese people. So what the author is trying to say is that by using like order, industry, peace, sobriety, they would say that Chinese people have good traits. They're ideal immigrants, um, but like it's unfair for the U.S. to ban immigration for Chinese people. That's what the author's saying, and it's inspired by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, 92, and 1902. So basically, from 1882, they proposed that because that Chinese people were basically they were afraid that Chinese people would take over the economy. They were like an economic threat because apparently they worked harder, so they were deemed as an economic threat, and they basically deprived them of their citizenship and immigration status. So this lasted for 10 years from 1882 all the way to 1992, 1892, and basically 1892 would then renew the act again for another 10 years, and by 1902 they made it permanent. So the Homestead Act, of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act was later stopped after the U.S. and China worked to fight in the Pacific against Japan. Uh, so anyway, back to immigration, the Homestead Act. So basically, the Homestead Act was this big incentive for people to originally immigrate towards the West. So you would basically go to the West, set in the Midwest, and settle there for 5 years, and like farm the land there, and then you would later buy the land for a cheap price. And it cost a lot of people to move towards the West, and the transcontinental railroad that was eventually built. Also, a lot of mass immigration towards the West as well. But however, many still went back towards east because of different factors such as infertile land. So basically, in the west, there will be like a small layer of fertile soil, but underneath will be like will be barren soil. So after they use the the fertile soil at the top, there's no more fertile soil for them to sustain themselves, and there's a lot of dust. So that's part of the reason why the Dust Bowl was created, and basically tore through the country because of mass farming in the West. And there was lack of an economy as well. So basically, when you were in the West, you were in solitude, you were isolated, and you couldn't get to any big communities anywhere. So you were just stuck on your farm farming until the 5 years are up, and you buy it for there and you stay over there. But there was a lack of infrastructure and economy in the West. That's for sure. and because of all this lack of like services, they couldn't like interact socially with a lot of people, and they were just very isolated, and they had a lack of economy. So you would during this time you would have a couple ways. You have two waves of major immigration. So as you know, you have the first wave of immigration from Europe. It will be usually like northwestern immigrants. So you would have like the English, the Germans, uh, basically Norwegian, Scandinavian people. You would have the second wave of immigrants. However, by the second wave of immigrants, instead of welcoming them nicely, they were treated as undesirables. So you have like Slavic people, you would have like Italian people, you have like Southern and Eastern Europeans coming into the U.S., but they were treated as undesirables, and basically they were given jobs to work in the factory. So a major part of immigration are push and pull factors. So basically, push factors uh, are basically are negative, usually negative factors that make people emigrate. Emigrate as in like they leave the country. So such as war, famine. The potato famine caused a lot of Irish to move to the U.S. You would have um, you have war, famine, disease. A lot of things are like push factors. Pull factors are like things that pull you to immigrate towards a certain country, to go into that certain country. So you would have like a strong economy. You would have like better living standards, uh, some sort of better government or something like that. You would have a lot of things that are pull factors as well. So, because of all this immigration, New York City was huge. It was becoming urbanized. There was a lot of things. There was a lot of things that caused New York to basically boom. But because of this huge boom in the city, it was basically a cesspool. There was a lot of disease. The living standards for especially poor people weren't that good. A lot of middle class people already moved to the suburbs, so they're not in the inner city, and like the more wealthy people had like manors and mansions right next to like tenements. So there's like this big wealth inequality that we'll address in the Gilded Age. But for now, just know that because of large scale immigration, New York City has become like a cesspool because it couldn't handle all this extra population. There were two although it became like a cesspool, many immigrants who arrived from Angel Island to New York City basically did not move because of a lack of inability. They were poor, they had no capital, they just came from bad circumstances to New York City, so they didn't have the means to move out, so they can only rent a tenement and like work in the factories. However, there were two populations of immigrants that had the means to move out generally. Uh, Generally, Germans had the capital. They arrived from Germany with a little bit of money. They managed to move out a little bit, maybe to other places like in the West to build farms there. And Jews had like the education. Basically, the parents would teach their children after they worked in the factories, and they would later go on in life escaping like the inner city. We'll go back to a little bit of urbanization, but just know that there were a lot of public spaces, suburbs, tenements, public transit. Public transit, as in like like what it's not a railroad per se, but like a cart in the city where you can take it and it acts like a railroad. I forgot the name of it. But you have public transit, you have suburbs, you have public spaces like public parks and stuff like that, like small parks and whatever. You have tenements. Jacob Reeves is a big part. He is muckraker that we'll talk about later in the Gilded Age. But know that for now, he wrote the book called How the Other Half Lives. Basically, it changed perspectives on how a lot of people were living, especially the newly arrived immigrants, where it basically showed a perspective of like the cesspool in in like the big cities and stuff. So basically, it showed how bad the living conditions were. Okay, and yeah, we'll talk about Jacob Rees a little bit later. So basically, there was a lot of pollution, disease, homelessness, crime and violence, and political machines in in like these urban areas. So as you remember, political machines that I talked about before, um, they were basically like help out these newly arrived immigrants in return for their vote and like so on and so forth until they get to the national level. Now let's move back from immigration to like maybe the West in general, perhaps. Okay, so the West. Well, let's talk about the West and Native Americans. They're basically like kind of the same topic because they're interchange. Like they're kind of they kind of correlate and like are very connected. So this is a huge topic, especially in Period Six, the West and Native Americans. So you would have a after some for some context, the Mexican American War just ended. Manifest Destiny is still going on. Where Manifest Destiny happened, where basically people believe that as Americans they have better institutions and like is a God-given right to colonize the to settle the whole continent, whole northern continent, and the Mexican American War basically gave a lot of land uh, in return for peace towards for the to the U.S. So they basically inherited a lot of Hispanic and Indian populations from the land they gained from the Mexican American War. And these populations were usually treated as second-class citizens. They weren't treated very well. Think of them as like on the same level of treatment as like the Chinese and like newly arrived immigrants. So basically, they were second class citizens. Uh, Many of them escaped. They try to escape from like federal authority. They try to stay in isolated groups. They created ethnic enclaves and stuff like that. People in the east, many of them escaped towards the west from urban areas because like they thought of the west as like this place of rejuvenation, of a way to keep your body healthy as opposed to like this disease-ridden urban areas. So hotels were built near national parks that were eventually created by Theodore Roosevelt. We'll talk about him in period 7. So one major person who marked the end of the frontier was Frederick Jackson Turner. He basically, in his thesis, basically stated that when the frontier closes, there would be a loss of utopia that basically marked U.S. imperialism, and they would become like a global power. So you would see later on in the Spanish-American War, uh, the Philippines, Hawaii. Basically, it marked that uh, because the frontier closed, they would need to look overseas for a new frontier to expand. In the West, there was poor treatment of the Native Americans. The Sioux tribe used a lot of buffalo for their sustainability, for their food source. So in return, but the Sioux tribe were still very resistant towards the U.S. So in return, the U.S. incentivized bounties on these buffaloes. So people would hunt these buffaloes for bounties and gain some money and fur. They eventually hunted them to near extinction in the Great Plains. Uh, and this was all in return for to like lessen Indian resistance because the Sioux tribe used these buffaloes as a food source. So basically, because of all these injustices, eventually Sitting Bull and the Sioux tribe later revolted, but like they were later subdued as well. The one big battle did occur. It was the Battle of Little Bighorn, where basically uh, this cavalry division was destroyed by this Native American army. Uh, the Dawes Act. Basically, here's a picture of the Dawes Act. Oh, here's a picture of Frederick Jackson Turner. This is a picture of the Dawes Act. Indian land for sale. Get a home for your own. Easy payments. Uh, Basically, fine lands in the West, which is not really true. It was actually very infertile. They did not give the best lands to the Native Americans. Um, so the Dawes Act, basically, it basically tried to stop Indian autonomy, try to steal their autonomy by giving them land. They can convert them into more quote unquote civilized people, more sophisticated people, and they basically took children to indoctrinate them in schools. In the West, like I said before, there was a lot of infertile land, dust bowls that caused a dust bowl. They were isolated. Uh, Basically, farmers in the West had a tough time because they had decreasing prices in terms of agriculture from overproduction. They were basically price gouged from railroad monopolies. We'll talk about them later in the Gilded Age. And the populist movement eventually formed from the farmers. We'll talk about them later in the Gilded Age. But they basically challenged big businesses and corrupt government. They challenged the political machines. They wanted they wanted monopolies to stop price gouging them. They wanted fair prices, regulations, stuff like that. It's kind of like an early progressive movement. We'll talk about them later in the Gilded Age. So yeah, basically, there was to give some context for the Gilded Age, corruption in the grants. Nope, there was like just a bunch of corruption. We have a lot of we have the Industrial Revolution, where basically all these new technologies are popping up, mass production is available. There was a boom in industry. Corruption, major controversies under Grant, the whiskey ring, Credit Mobile, whiskey ring extorted illegal whiskey. Credit Mobile uh, gave exclusive contracts and bribed Congress. Okay, let's go to. Oh, here's a picture of tenements. We'll get more into that and the state of living in terms of the Gilded Age. There's a big contrast from the wealth inequality from these people towards like John D. Rockefeller. You have J.P. Morgan, so big wealth inequality in inner cities. So there's a picture of tenements. It's overcrowded, cesspool, disease, dirty, violence. Usually, the violence is from the political machines and gangs, labor gangs. Okay, so let's start off with some with the Gilded Age. Okay, Gilded Age. So basically, uh, Grant made a Species Resumption Act. So basically, the government created notes that were pegged to gold and allowed people to cash out greenbacks. And this is just a small act, just in case if you ever get if you have a need to use this act as an example in your DBQ. Uh, but let's start. Let's get into the main topic. So in the West, we would have this extractive industry. So basically, they would turn metal into steel. There was oil. There was stuff like that. In the West, we have like cattle kingdom, boom towns. So extractive industries were like taking the minerals from the ground and turning into usable products like steel and oil. And then you would have like a lot of new technology from the industrial revolution that allowed for mass production and eventually like monopolies and stuff like that. And the land from the west, the newly settled west, there was a lot of extracted wealth, like the gold rush. Boom towns happened, where basically people would find gold there, settle there, mine it out for like a few years, and then after all the gold is gone, it turns into a ghost town. They would settle different places for more boom towns, and the cycle of ghost town, boost town. Um you have the cattle kingdom. I would argue this is the first real monopoly. Not first real monopoly, first real industrial boom. And basically, before Texas had a lot of cattle, they would just but they had no reach to sell in a different market. They couldn't reach greater market. So what they did was that when the transcontinental railroad was constructed, it allowed Texas to drive the cattle into wider markets, and like the Chisholm Trail was basically a lot of cowboys, but there was also a lot. It basically allowed the the kind of formation of the romanticized West, where there were like cowboys and stuff like that. This was during the cattle kingdom era, where basically they would just like drive cattle into wider markets from the transcontinental railroad. But to get to the railroad, they first had to go through the Chisholm Trail, and cowboys were like the protectors of the cattle, where they would herd the cattle towards the railroad. And like there were a lot of casualties. Eventually, this was the first industrial boom, which was a pretty big thing because it was treated as like a kind of like quick, easy cash almost, like stonks. Think of it as stonks. Okay, in the East, we have Carnegie. Carnegie basically brought back the Bessemer's method from England. Bessemer, Besmer, Bessemer's method. Basically, the method includes turning iron to steel. Basically, superheated iron were blew with hot air to turn into steel from carbon. He brought that technique from England to the U.S. and he eventually created U.S. Steel, which was the first steel monopoly. Talking about all these big monopolists. You have okay. Let's start off with Andrew Carnegie. He was basically a kind of rags to riches tale. He was very lucky and very hardworking. He built the first steel suspension bridge and the first U.S. corporation to mass produce steel. He did things like he wrote a book on the gospel of wealth. Basically, he argued that monopolies were good. Monopolies were like kind of necessary. Uh, they were saying like basically it was also the job of a wealthy patron to help out their like poor brethren. That was basically what the gospel was said. Then you have like John D. Rockefeller. He built Standard Oil. He get kerosene from the Ohio River Valley, and later built combustible engine. And like when combustible engines came out, he he gave them gasoline. He also did the 1873, the Panic of 1873, where basically these railroads were getting cheated by Rockefeller for a very low price to ship his oil. And because by that time there were so many railroads, a lot of there was railroads propping up over the country. A lot of railroads were over there, so there was a lot of competitors as well. So all these railroads were being cheated by them. So they gathered into like this railroad union and stated that you better give us a better price. So they basically try to extort Rockefeller. Rockefeller pulled all of his oil from the railroads, and in return, uh, the railroads basically went bankrupt. A lot of them did. And investment banks who were speculating into more railroads to build more railroads basically lost all their investments, and they in turn became bankrupt. And eventually, because the banks went bankrupt, people panicked and started taking out their money from the banks and became a bank run. And it just it caused almost caused the economy to crash. You have going back to monopolists. You have Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was the first real monopoly. He basically owned the railways from Chicago to New York, and like originally had a ferry business, but he made some railways from Chicago to New York and basically charged his prices. Fun fact: he worked with Rockefeller to ship his oil as well. Then you have J.P. Morgan. He's the guy who funded Thomas Edison to form General Electric, and he also owned the largest investment bank in the world. Um, so a big thing about these two is that while the Gilded Age is considered a wealth of an age of prosperity and industrial boom, there was a big notion that there was like a false notion that if you work hard enough, you can become people like Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie by working hard enough. But they were the exceptions. They were extremely lucky into becoming rich. Most monopolists were like J.P. Morgan, where he inherited the wealth and started using that money to build more, to gain more money, and eventually make a monopoly. Then you have Henry Ford. You would create the assembly line for automobiles. You have the Wright brothers during this time. They were not a monopoly, but like they created flight during the Gilded Age. You have so basically this is a lot of monopolies, but a person under Henry Ford called Taylor uh, basically created the science of motion, the science of work, where basically stated that as long as you can decrease the amount of motion a person is sitting there doing to create a product, they can be dedicated to specific tasks and increase efficiency. So that's how Henry Ford got his assembly line going. And so you would have a lot of during this time you have a lot of railroads. You would have a lot of increased markets, wider markets. People had more access to markets and more profits. It was less expensive and faster to ship across the country. However, people were, especially farmers, were still being price gouged by the railroad monopolists. So to start off, we need to separate ways of creating a monopoly. You would have vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical integration is basically where you take over the supply chain, you take over the producers, you take over the manufacturers, you take over the retailers. This is how Andrew Carnegie got hold of his wealth. He did vertical integration. He took over basically the whole supply chain, and that way he created U.S. Steel. Rockefeller, he did a little bit both, but his most prominent one was horizontal integration, where he basically took over his competitors, and that way it was basically he owned the market. But he did take over his supply chain as well, a little of his supply chain. But he was famed for horizontal integration. Anyway, basically why did corporations form? Corporations basically raised a lot of capital faster. They had the power to raise more capital, and they also limit personnel liability. So let's say Rockefeller created a business, another business. He invested like $1 million, right? He invested like 10% into the business. He got 10% of that stock. Another 9 dudes invested 10% into that stock as well. If the company fails, instead of paying for the whole like $10 million, he only paid 1 million, and he only wasted 1 million as well. So limited personal liability. You would have general corporation charters. Basically, it meant that all these companies can form as long as they apply towards the government. Uh, you would have Okay, so basically, I forgot to mention the cons and pros of monopolies. Monopolies basically gave you greater efficiency in terms of mass production. However, they did increase the price and lower the quality of products as well. The idea of trust and holds. Basically, holds allows corporations to buy out other corporations, a corporation owning another corporation, basically. And a trust is what Rockefeller did. He basically got all the companies to put into a stock into his bigger company, uh, and as the CEO of that company, he now controls all his other competitors. But as in return, as he gains more and more money, uh, however much stock that those competitors put in, they also gain a percentage of that money. So it was a win-win scenario, and he managed to control all the supply of oil. Then you would have, of course, during the time you have laissez-faire economics. Basically, the government doesn't want to interfere in the natural course of the market. The invisible hand will allow itself to basically control the will of supply and demand. Government does not interfere. You have social Darwinism, capitalists use the assumption that uh, like they're just better fit to in this Gilded Age to work. They were more hardworking and more intelligent or whatever, and use that to perpetuate the status quo and justify like their huge amount of wealth. Like their amount of wealth was very grotesque. Because in the inner city you would have one manor, a block of manors, and the next block would be a block of tenements, basically. And you have like the formation of the middle class. Yay! So basically, the middle class formed from like middle managers, doctors, lawyers, whatever, and they basically moved into the suburbs. They formed from professionalism. During the Gilded Age, there were a lot of charlatans, conmen. They basically sell like fake products, like oh, this bottle of snake oil uh, will help you, I don't know, cure cancer. Obviously, does did not. So professionals in these businesses would join up together and say, okay, we don't want our reputation to be ruined. In return, uh, we will basically form like this guild almost, and give like certificates to show that this guy is certified for their job. That's professionalism. Um, so you that contributed towards the growth of the middle class. Uh, Important to note, some monopolists like Andrew Carnegie did have social services. He did state that he would it was the duty of a wealthier man to provide for the uh, poor man. You would have immigrant workforce in the Northeast. There was no compensation for injury. There was little wages. There was no working time limit. No work time limit. It was very hazardous. It was bad conditions. It was very dirty as well. You have child labor. Basically, children were fit to go into these small nook and crannies and fix machine parts or whatever. Uh, they did more delicate work, but there was child labor. Okay, because all these poor conditions, unions basically started to form up. They would collectively bargain, where basically they would form into unions and say that we won't work unless you make some concessions and give us some benefits. The government usually sided with the capitalists before the progressives during laissez-faire economics. That was before early progressives like Theodore Roosevelt created a fair square deal almost. But before that, they usually sided with the capitalists. Um, so unions were not particularly happy. Uh, so in return, what happened was like a lot of strikes happened. So you would have like 1877, the Great Railroad Strike. You would have the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, where basically Hayes had to send the National Guard to restart the economy after the Union basically stop working in the railroads, and basically there was a lack of shipment in the country. You would have the Homestead Strike of 1892, uh, where basically um, where you basically have like use a picture of the Homestead strike. So basically, the union workers in the U.S. Steel basically rioted, and because and the manager of the corporate of this factory at the time didn't make any concessions, they grabbed their weapons and started resorting to violence. In return, the manager hired a mercenary company to go to the factory and started try to pacify the workers there. The workers were trying to stop all the other workers from going to the company and working, but they used violence to do so, as seen in this picture. So basically, it was very violent. It basically That was basically the Homestead Strike of 1892. It was just a violent riot. You have the Haymarket Square where the police were bombed. Um, and you would have the Pullman strike of 1894, where basically uh, the workers of this company uh, were basically not giving enough wages, and like everything they owned was from the company. The company owned their housing, the groceries, the wages, everything dictated in their lives were by the company. So they formed a union and striked out. It did not go so well because the capitalists were sided with the government as well. So there was two major unions. The one was the Knights of Labor. They allowed women and brought smaller unions together. Next was the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. They basically were a mixed success. They put off all these strikes, but they were still seen as militant because of strikes like the Homestead strike. So Labor was seen as militant. They were seen as aggressive, very bad, basically. Corruption everywhere during the Gilded Age. Uh, but because of all this corruption, Republicans did want reform. There was two sides of Republicans. The first were the stalwarts and the half-breeds. So basically, the stalwarts were basically the conservative Republicans. They didn't want anything to change. Half-breeds were like, okay, we gotta do some progressive ideas. We gotta make some government jobs to based on merit instead of instead of bias. So President Garfield tried implementing a progressive reform, but was assassinated. But Vice President Arthur eventually turned president, made the Pendleton Act of 1883, Pendleton, and basically gave government positions based on merit instead of like recommendations and stuff. State governments were more radical. They were easier to implement more progressive ideas. Eventually, these progressive ideas will start working, and they went into a national level. Farmers were still badly price gouged. They suffered a lot. So during the agrarian revolt, basically think of it as like farmers forming into their own like collectives. They have like these collectives called the Garganers, Grangers, Garganers, and the Farmers Alliance. So basically, they would form into these collectives, pool their money together, create these farms and stuff like that. They would like think of them as a union, but like they were able to collectively bargain with like railroad monopolies and stuff like that. They have more power in that way. Um, and you would have these farmers. Basically, they eventually form like the Populist Party that sympathized with with like movement of labor, and basically they want the Populist Party that resulted from these farmers. Basically wanted like free silver. They wanted less corruption. They wanted regulations. They wanted small regulations and like stuff like that. That was like the Populist Party. Free silver because as free silver was originally demonetized by the federal government and it was the money was pegged to gold instead, not gold and silver anymore. But as more silver was found, farmers who were still in big debt because of like the decreased prices and stuff like that, they wanted you to the money to be pegged to silver again, so that way they can pay off their debt easier. Uh, However, because the debt was like was uh, was like a set amount at most, and because the free silver will be pegged, it was easier to pay off. But like going back on topic, people in the government said no originally, and like the populist movement wanted to have free silver as well. You would have social justice and social gospel. Basically, the social justice means that people, especially in the inner city, started believing that okay, the government should step in instead of allowing laissez-faire and not interfere. Step in and give some benefits towards like poor people. Give some benefits to help them out. Social gospel was basically this belief that many white Christian women had at the time, basically this belief that um, people should be allowed to live dignified lives. So no like overworked, little wage, dirty environments. They believe that you should have a dignified life. You have the suffrage movement. Basically, they want the right to vote at the time. You have the Temperance Crusade, which was basically a lot of women were getting hurt by drunken husbands and saloon. Like they would see these their husbands would go to the saloon, come back and beat up their wife. So the Temperance Crusade started, where a lot of women who were also part of the suffrage movement um, basically stated that we want the prohibition of alcohol. So that's how the 18th Amendment started. We'll talk about that in Period 7. For now, that should be all. Um, Anything else? It's an hour and 6 minutes. Do you guys have any questions? Okay, I just gotta end the stream now. See ya.